David Swartney. I run the environmental research program at the University of Iowa Public Policy Center. We are hosting this event. We have some co-sponsors that I want to make sure we acknowledge. We're incredibly grateful to Prairie Lights for giving us the venue. We've got the School of Journalism and Mass Communication at Iowa's co-sponsor of this event, as well as the Department of English. And I wanted just to provide real quickly a little bit of context. The Daily Iowa did a nice piece on Carey about her visit, and one of the questions they asked me was, why did we want to bring her out to Iowa? And I'm certainly not going to tell the story of glyphosate and Roundup, but that's the story that she's here for. But, I mean, I show this to my classes all the time, that we're the epicenter. We use it, corn and soy. And so, you know, my concern, and I think that's why we want to have Carey here to present her side of the story, her expertise, share it with us, is that for us it's not just glyphosate. We know this, right? It's also atrazine and chlorpyrifos and 2,4-D and acetochlor. And the list goes on and on. We are not just thinking about one chemical these days. We're thinking about all the chemicals we use to feed the world. So it's not a surprise that with work like I do at the university, we look for it in water, our resources, and it's not surprising to find the chemicals we apply to the land in our water. And so we can find it in things like the university drinking water system. And what it boils down to is every day, whether we realize it or not, we are putting faith in the agencies and the institutions that are supposed to tell us that these chemicals are safe. We don't think about it in our everyday lives, but there are people at the EPA and the FDA who are telling us what is safe and what is not, and we assume that that process is done thinking about the people first and the profit second. But then you see the headlines about EPA rejecting its own scientists' findings. Or you see the headlines about potential collusion between EPA investigators and chemical industry. And so, you know, why we wanted to bring Carey out, that brings us back to Carey, is I can't think of anyone who's researched these issues better. I've been following her, thank God, for social media for some time to stay up to date on these issues. So since 1998, she's been working on agriculture. She was a senior correspondent for Reuters. She's now is the research director for U.S. Right to Know. She is a leading authority. She has produced Whitewash, which is a meticulously researched story about glyphosate, Roundup, and some of the controversy around it that has been being played out in real time. So without any further ado, let's welcome Carey to tell her story.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction and everybody for coming out tonight. Can you hear me okay? Is that
And this
good?
moves too to where you're comfortable. So feel free to.
Is that fine? Too loud? Too soft? Okay. All right, great. Thank you very much. So Whitewash, yeah, this book, most of the people who have read it, who want to talk to me about it afterwards, tell me that it makes them really mad, really angry, really frustrated. It's, as I say here, it's not a feel-good story, but I feel like it's a story that has to be told. The problem that we have in this country with pervasive pesticides is not getting any better. It's growing. It affects our health. It affects our environment. It affects the future for our children. I haven't become a very popular person in publishing this book and trying to tell this story. The chemical industry just published a review of my book yesterday, one of the chemical industry partners, that calls this book hogwash instead of whitewash. But I'm hoping that you won't find it to be that way. Let me see if I can get this thing to work correctly. Did I do it? Yeah. So whitewash is focused really on one chemical, and that's glyphosate. And many of you probably know about glyphosate. It's been in the news a lot lately. Glyphosate is the active ingredient in Monsanto's branded Roundup products. It's also used in several hundred other products. Monsanto introduced it to the market in 1974, but the patent expired in the United States in the year 2000. So this is a chemical that's used by many different companies in many different products, but we know it best probably as Roundup. It's used by homeowners, right, in our lawns and gardens to keep those looking nice and neat. It's used by golf course operators. It's used in children's parks and playgrounds. It's used along utility lines, and of course it's incredibly popular in agriculture, used by farmers in conjunction with the production of more than 70 different types of crops, food crops, that we eat and that our livestock eat. The book focuses on glyphosate, but I do need to make clear that it's really also about many different pesticides and the dangers that these bring. Glyphosate and Monsanto is really sort of the poster child, I say, for these problems. One of the biggest companies. Glyphosate is the most widely used agricultural chemical in our history. But as you mentioned, you have a range of other atrazine, chlorpyrifos, a range of pesticides that are being used at alarming levels in mixtures and combinations that haven't often been tested rigorously, leaving residues in our food and our drinking water and in our own bodies. And these are things that the government and the pesticide industry tries very hard to keep us from knowing and tries to downplay. But the evidence is there and the information is there, and that's what I've tried to put in the book. These are some what I call not so fun facts. Over 1 billion pounds of pesticides are used in the United States each year. Did I go wrong? About 80% of those are used in agriculture, about 5.6 billion pounds worldwide. U.S. Department of Agriculture estimates about 50 million people in the United States get their drinking water from groundwater that is potentially contaminated by pesticides. Exposure to pesticides is a risk factor for cancer and other diseases and neurodevelopmental problems, including ADHD, autism, things like that are affecting our children. And I'm guessing probably everybody in this room knows somebody who has cancer or has had cancer, or maybe you have cancer yourself. We now are at a point where 1 in 2 men are expected to be diagnosed with cancer in their lifetimes, 1 in 3 women. And that just staggers my mind. But these are the facts. More than 600,000 people are expected to die this year. 1.6 million expected to be newly diagnosed. The research shows connections between pesticides and cancers like non-Hodgkin lymphoma, multiple myeloma, prostate, liver, pancreatic, lung, non-melanoma skin cancers. The National Toxicology Program in 2016, I thought, made a really good point. They put out a report that talks about cancer and these incidents of cancer and what do we do about it. And we're always so focused on treatment, right? The newest treatments and what can we do. And they're saying we really need to focus on prevention. And part of that is focusing on pesticides and environmental contaminants, because they are known to contribute to this. This is my favorite person in history, Rachel Carson, brilliant, scientist, researcher, writer, wrote the book Silent Spring. Her book looked at DDT, much like mine looks at glyphosate, but really, like with glyphosate and like what she did with DDT, it's just a vehicle for the larger story about the dangers of pervasive pesticide use. And her message was, we need to be cognizant of the impacts of unchecked pesticide use, and people listened to her. Her book and her work helped drive the formation of the Environmental Protection Agency and spurred sort of the modern day environmental movement, with different organizations. But as I write in Whitewash, what I feel like we've forgotten those lessons, and we've swung so far in the other direction now. And we really need to be reminded of that. So the book is not just about pesticides. I'd like to say it's about people. In my reporting career, I found the best way to tell stories about subjects that are often dry or maybe don't sound like you want to read about them through people, right? I mean, this is what it's all about. So the book opens with Terry and Jack McCall, married 40 years, beautiful farm in Cambria, California, my dream farm. Growing citrus crops and avocados and right by the ocean, just a beautiful picture book kind of life, until Jack was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin lymphoma. He didn't use any pesticides on his farm other than Roundup because he felt it to be so safe, and he used it pretty liberally. So because I've been told it's a good thing to read, I'm going to read just a tiny bit from the first chapter. Standing on the ridge overlooking her coastal California farm, Terry McCall sees her late husband Jack nearly everywhere. There atop the highest hill is where the couple married in 1975, two self-described hippies who knew more about how to surf than how to farm. Midway up the hill, on a lush plateau surrounded by the lemon, avocado, and orange trees Jack planted, sits the 800-square-foot house the then-young Vietnam War veteran built for his bride, and a family that grew to include 2 sons and a daughter. One of those sons now lives there with his own wife and small son. The solar panels that Jack set up in a sun-drenched stretch of grass help power the farm's irrigation system. Terry was only 17 when she met 23-year-old Jack, just after he returned from Vietnam. He had been a first lieutenant in the 101st Airborne Division and received both a Bronze Star and a Distinguished Flying Cross for his service. When Terry saw him, though, he didn't look like a soldier, but more like a big kid laughing and playing frisbee with friends. She remembers being almost instantly smitten by his rugged good looks and his easy smile. It took 5 years before they became more than friends, and then 40 years passed all too quickly. Literally hundreds of times a day, something reminds me of him, McCall tells me as I stand beside her on the ridge one bright spring morning, a few months after Jack's death. Her tears start to flow. That's part of why it's so hard to believe, to know that even if I search the whole world, look everywhere, I can't find him now. She shakes her head. It's so hard to believe I can never see him again. Anthony Jack McCall, age 69, died December 26, 2015, after a painful and perplexing battle with an aggressive form of non-Hodgkin lymphoma, a type of cancer that forms in the lymphatic system and can appear anywhere in the body. The loss is certain, fixed forever in his family's heartbreak. But questions about why and how he was stricken, a man who never smoked, who stayed fit, who had no history of cancer in his family, swirl around his use of the popular weed killer Roundup and the active ingredient glyphosate. So the book takes you not only to their farm, but takes you into Argentina and to Hawaii and to different places around the United States and to Europe, and really talks about the people who are affected and who are questioning the safety of this chemical right now. Terry is one of about 3,500 people who are now suing Monsanto, specifically alleging that glyphosate and Roundup caused them or their loved ones to develop non-Hodgkin lymphoma. The lawsuits are alleging both that Roundup caused the non-Hodgkin lymphoma, but also that Monsanto knew about the risks, knew about the dangers, and has worked very hard to cover it up. And through this litigation, it's a reporter's dream because Monsanto's tried very hard to get these lawsuits thrown out and has not been successful. And so they've been subject to discovery. And that means they've had to turn over millions of pages of internal records, internal emails and reports and memos and things. And it's really eye-opening. A lot of that information is in the book, but a lot of the information supports the notion that they, have worked very hard for a very long time to deceive the public and regulators and others. The lawsuits all started after the International Agency for Research on Cancer declared glyphosate to be a probable human carcinogen. That was in March of 2015. And they found a specific association to non-Hodgkin lymphoma. They looked at epidemiology, they looked at toxicology data, a range of research studies that have been done around the world by independent academics and others, and they decided, putting it all together, it looked like a probable human carcinogen. They didn't say it was definite, but it was more than just possible looking at this. Now, Monsanto has worked to discredit them. You may have heard this in the news. They've been working really hard to say that these international cancer scientists who are pulled from the elite cancer agencies around the world and receive no money for the work that they do on this, that they were politically motivated and relying on junk science and can't be believed. And we have Republicans in Congress now who are siding with the chemical industry and who are saying that we should strip funding from this global cancer science agency because of their classification of glyphosate. There was a hearing February 6th in Washington, D.C. to take up that very issue. But what we see in the documents, even though Monsanto was so outraged and so shocked and so surprised, you see in their internal documents that they expected that IARC would rate them a probable or a possible carcinogen. And this is a document that they put together in February 2015, which was before IARC even met on glyphosate. And they say we should assume and prepare for a possible or probable human carcinogen rating. Another email talks about what we've long been concerned about has happened. They're going to take a look at it. Oh my gosh. We have vulnerability in the areas of epidemiology, exposure, genotox. They knew the science was out there. They knew it was going to finally get scrutinized, and they were trying to figure out what to do about it. So what they decided was that they would orchestrate outcry. This is all, again, before IARC even met to talk about glyphosate. They plan out, it's a very lengthy document, they plan out how they're going to discredit IARC using front groups and other scientists and planted false news stories to try to discredit these international scientists. And they've done a pretty good job if you look at Congress and what's going on there right now. But that's only really one area of deception. The documents that have come out, both through Freedom of Information requests that I've done and other people I work with. I've got several thousand pages from EPA and FDA and USDA. And then you combine those with the documents from Monsanto's litigation, and you see all of these different strategies. And one of them is called ghostwriting. Monsanto themselves use the term ghostwriting, where they want research to appear independent, trumpeting the safety of their chemical. But in fact, they're the ones writing it. And this is just an internal memo referring to kind of a couple different things. And you can see, they're talking about we'll pay these guys, we'll get their names on it, they'll edit and sign it, but we'll be the ones actually ghostwriting it, actually doing it. And you see them say, recall that's how we handled Williams, Crows, and Moreau 2000. The Williams 2000 paper is a paper that every regulator in the world has relied very heavily on in saying that glyphosate is safe. And we see here that Monsanto talks about ghostwriting that. This is another one. This is Grime 2015. It's another one that our EPA cites as proof that glyphosate is safe. Here you see David Salmaris, a toxicologist at Monsanto, boasting about ghostwriting it. This is a paper on reproductive impacts of glyphosate. The paper that was published talks about how it has no reproductive problems whatsoever. You can see in the draft, Donna Farmer, senior toxicologist with Monsanto, was part of it. You see when it's actually published, her name's not anywhere on it. But from the internal documents, we see her discussing all the different things that she's putting into this paper to support the safety of glyphosate, even though when they're not going to let anybody know that she was part of it. And one more example, because I guess I like to give these examples. This one I find more egregious. This was aimed at European regulators and at combating IARC. In the disclosures, it says, of this paper, if you look it up, it says neither any Monsanto employee nor attorney reviewed any of the expert panel manuscripts. In the internal emails, you see that that Bill Hayden's a senior Monsanto scientist is essentially writing it and refreshing and rereading and editing, and they're trying to figure out who will be the author, who should we put on here. I mean, this stuff just goes on and on and on. There are more types of ghostwriting. They draft, and we've seen in the documents, draft and outlining articles and policy briefs that come out looking like they're under, again, independent scientist name. They outline presentations and communications for some academic professors, that they will provide funding for these professors, and then the professors will do presentations that are prepared by Monsanto, but they don't disclose that Monsanto prepared them. There have been examples talked about in the book where they assign papers to different individuals. If the individuals don't have time to write them, Monsanto will write them for them. There was a recent scandal you might have read about in Forbes magazine, articles that appeared to be coming from an independent scientist, but the documents that were turned over through litigation showed that Monsanto had actually been writing word for word these articles in Forbes magazine. So Forbes magazine cut off that relationship with that author, but he's still writing in Newsweek. Anyway, front groups is another strategy. They have a whole lot of different organizations that they set up that appear to be, independent or consumer focused or rancher focused, with different degrees of funding and different degrees of influence. But these groups weigh in quite heavily on matters of policy. And these are some other ones: Academics Review, Genetic Literacy Project. This one we love, Campaign for Accuracy in Public Health Research. That is solely funded by the American Chemistry Council. The primary goal is to discredit IARC. That's all they do on their website. Sense About Science and Biofortified. These groups were listed in a Monsanto internal email as partners that they could push propaganda out through. But yet, if you talk to these people, they will say that they are completely independent. Biofortified is the one that put out the book review calling my book hogwash yesterday. This is I like to share this. This is Academics Review. This was a University of Illinois professor that had been getting a lot of money from Monsanto, and he was retiring, and they came up with this great idea that he could set up this website called Academics Review that could weigh in on policy matters and write critical things about scientists and journalists and others who raise safety questions. And this is an email from Monsanto's Eric Sachs in which he's talking about, from my perspective, problem is one of expert engagement. We'll pay some experts. The key will be keeping Monsanto in the background so as not to harm the credibility of the information. So if you just go to this website and you read everything that's on it, you're like, wow, all of these people warning us about pesticides are crazy and bad, and the chemical industry is so wonderful. Nowhere on that website will it say that it was set up, with the assistance of Monsanto. So all of this has combined. You kind of showed this map, I guess, right? Maybe not. With all of this propaganda and all of this push and the front groups and what we have is we've had an explosion of glyphosate use. From 1992, this is only through 2001, so it's really outdated, obviously, but you've seen use expanded from about 40 million pounds in the 90s to about 300 million pounds a year now in the United States of this chemical. And this is primarily tied to the introduction of genetically engineered crops. That's what occurred in the mid-1990s. And even though you, I'm sure, have heard that these crops are about, growing better in drought and yielding more and being more nutritious and feeding the world, the truth when they were introduced in the 90s and the truth today is that these crops are about selling more herbicide. Most of the crops, there's some 457, if I'm remembering my stats right, million acres around the world planted to GMO crops. And most of those, the most widely planted trait is herbicide tolerance. It's not drought tolerance, it's not yield, it's about selling more herbicide. And Monsanto planned for this when they introduced crops, the GMO crops. They ramped up production of glyphosate. And this is only through 2001. This is the first 6 years. But you see, after they introduced this, demand and the company's market share soared in this. And that's, again, that was just the first 6 years. It's a brilliant plan. What happened, though, is the environment kind of pushed back a little bit and said, weed resistance, right? This is a weed. This is a water hemp in a soybean field, 2012. And when I was reporting on all these issues, and the weed scientists were warning when genetically engineered crops were introduced, they said, you're going to create a nightmare with weed resistance. You're going to create a nightmare in the environment. And Monsanto and the EPA said, no, this is going to be fine. And I believed them, but clearly it was not fine. And these types of weeds now, we have more than 100 million acres around the United States of weeds that are resistant to glyphosate, which is a problem because glyphosate, farmers have become so reliant on it, right, to kill their weeds. And when they can't kill their weeds, it affects production, it affects yield. Farmers in many parts of the South are having to hand weed, bring in people to hand weed fields, or they're trying to douse these weeds with ever higher volumes of glyphosate, or they're trying to apply now dicamba and 2,4-D in new combinations on new genetically engineered crops that allow the farmers to spray glyphosate and 2,4-D, or glyphosate and dicamba. It's a vicious, cycle. It's a vicious pesticide treadmill. This is just one little more graphic about what we've seen with glyphosate-resistant weeds worldwide, which Monsanto told us wouldn't happen. So as a result, what do we have? Well, we have a lot of glyphosate in our food, we think. Private tests, academics, different universities, and private consumer groups and all have been trying to test for glyphosate residues in our foods. We know we have pesticide residues in our foods. It's planned for and outlined by our EPA and our USDA and our FDA. The question always is, well, at what levels? Well, our USDA and FDA do not want to test for glyphosate in our food. Every year, both USDA and FDA test several thousand food products for several hundreds of different types of pesticides to determine if they are effectively within legal levels that the EPA has set. They never test for glyphosate, which to me is ironic and maybe maybe something more than that, because it is the most widely used agrochemical. So you have other groups who have been trying to test, and this is what they found. You find it in a whole variety of snacks and cereals and things like that. And it's been found. Talk about a university professor in my book who was very skeptical and decided to test flour products and was shocked to find it in all of the flour products that he tested. So now I have to explain why the FDA found it. So the FDA and USDA, as I said, have resisted testing for glyphosate for decades. They came under scrutiny by the Government Accountability Office that said, you guys really need to test for this, you're not doing your job. So in 2016, the FDA said, all right, you know what, we will actually start testing for glyphosate. Everybody else is doing it, we'll start doing it. Well, one of their senior chemists, a guy who actually used to work for Syngenta, started doing some tests, and lo and behold, he found oatmeal with a lot of glyphosate in it. He also, I don't think I have a slide on the honey, do I? No. He also found it in honey samples, including organic honey. They started finding it at illegally high levels in some things. So what happened was the FDA testing program was suspended and the chemist was pulled from any more pesticide residue testing. So we're now into 2018 and we still don't have any official glyphosate testing from our FDA or our USDA. Although internal documents show me they're still talking about it and thinking about it, and FDA is still trying to figure out how to do it. But they did recently, in an internal memo, warn their scientists not to test honey, for crying out loud. Please don't test honey, because we know what we're going to find in honey. And so, with it in our food, it's in our bodies. This was University of California, San Diego School of Medicine. This came out in October. And this is obviously just one slide. It's a pretty robust paper. They tracked people from the 1990s for about 20 years and found that exposure climbed about 500%, basically. They were finding it in more people that they were screening, and they were finding it at higher levels in these people. So glyphosate, as I said, glyphosate isn't the only thing we need to worry about or talk about. I think call it the poster child, but our food supply is doused with pesticides. It's the go-to. We've been told by the companies that make the profits off this that this is the way to feed the world, that this is the way to grow the food. And as a result, 85% of foods tested by the USDA in their most recent report showed pesticide residues. Now, that was the highest level in more than a decade in terms of the prevalence of it. And I'm going to read just one little more thing about that. This is the part that just upsets me. So, pesticide residues can be found in everything from mushrooms to potatoes and grapes to green beans. One sample of strawberries examined by the USDA in an annual testing program found residues of 20 different pesticides in the berries. In fact, roughly 85% of more than 10,000 foods sampled tested by the USDA in 2015 carried pesticide residues. Most of the foods are fruits and vegetables, both fresh and processed, foods consumers generally consider healthy. Residue levels higher than what the government allows have been found in spinach, strawberries, grapes, green beans, tomatoes, cucumbers, and watermelon. Even residues of chemicals long banned in the United States were found as recently as 2015, including residues of DDT or its metabolites found in spinach and potatoes. Now, the USDA asserts that all of these pesticide residues are nothing for people to worry about, but many scientists say there's no data to back up that claim. We don't know if you eat an apple that has multiple residues every day, what will be the consequences 20 years down the road, said Chen-Sheng Liu, Associate Professor of Environmental Exposure Biology at the Harvard School of Public Health. They want to assure everybody that this is safe, but the science is quite inadequate, he said. This is a big issue. So, that brings me to why I care. Because I have kids. I have 3 kids. You guys probably have kids. We're going to have kids. There's extensive research, it's not in dispute, that children are hurt by pesticides. Pesticide exposure is not good for our children, both dietary as well as, out in the yards where they're rolling around or, playing, or if they're being sprayed, like my little nephew who lives, near farm fields where aerial spraying goes on. The corporations who make money off these chemicals tell us it's fine, but we know it's not fine. The data does not support that notion, especially at the pervasive level that we're seeing pesticides. And this is American Academy of Pediatrics. People are trying to raise alarm bells, but sometimes it's hard to get people to listen. This is an agricultural health study. This is a very large umbrella of research that is done by sort of under the oversight of EPA and National NIEHS and our different National Cancer Institute. And this is just a brief snapshot. I mean, there are thousands of pages there, but breast cancer, ovarian, thyroid, kidney, non-Hodgkin, Parkinson's, aggressive prostate cancer are all found to be linked to these pesticides. And this is a paper that came out in December. This is from the head of our NIEHS, National Institutes of Health Department. I can't even read it all. And the head of our National Toxicology Program. Again, saying we need to be awake and we need to take care of this and address it. The most vulnerable population, our children, face the highest risks. Now, it's noteworthy that this individual, this scientist, Linda Birnbaum, in this paper, she says we need more protective health policy. We need to be more protective of public health. And wouldn't you know that the Republican leadership of the House Science, Space, and Technology Committee is going after her for that. She should not be calling for protective health policy, according to Lamar Smith, and he's called for her to be investigated. Rachel Carson, once again, the big chemical companies want us all to be quiet. They want us all to not think about it, not worry about it. But I, think differently. And this is my favorite quote from her. If having endured much, we have at last asserted our right to know, and if by knowing we have concluded we are being asked to take senseless and frightening risks, we should no longer accept the counsel of those who tell us that we must fill our world with poisonous chemicals. We should look about and see what other courses open to us. And I guess that's what I'm hoping to do with the book, is just to encourage people to become educated, informed, engaged, and advocate for policies to protect our health and our environment. And this is the group I'm working with now, doing research, U.S. Right to Know, little tiny nonprofit. But pretty much all we do is file freedom of information requests and gather documents and put them on our webpage. We've just forged an agreement with University UCSF in San Francisco to put all of those documents up on a webpage where people can search them easily and that sort of thing. So thank you.
If you have questions, raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone to you.
Yeah, this is
very exciting, we were going to buy your book. But I served on the Council of Agriculture, Science and Technology from 1989 to 1996. Very interesting time in that group, and we kept mentioning, and I think I was like the executive council because I kept saying, but what about the impact of the pesticides? And the weed scientists on CAST always, well, first of all, they didn't understand probabilistic statistics. They couldn't understand any of the things where you show disease prevalence in areas where there's high, pesticide use. They couldn't buy those, and they would say, well, I've drank Roundup and I'm fine. This sort of thing was going on way back when they were just beginning to push it out.
Right.
And it was really kind of appalling. And so even then, at least there were some people on the Council of Agriculture, Science and Technology who said, wait, we've got to look at that. But the big voice was those weed scientists who said, no, it's fine. It's all fine. There's one over here who's of course, okay. And then who's next over here?
On the one slide that you showed that with all the snack foods, the Oreos.
Oh, right,
and the
right.
Blueberries.
Yeah. Sorry.
Okay,
Go ahead.
on that one, you indicated parts per billion, and you showed how many parts per billion per product, but I'm wondering what is the level where it's considered in excess?
Well,
besides zero.
yeah, and that's different. So like that's different for every ingredient. Like there's not a legal level for Wheaties.
There's not a legal level for Cheerios. There are legal levels for oats and corn and soy and that kind of thing. And it varies. So some of these, I do know that some of these levels would be illegal, depending on what ingredient you're looking at and what, because it's not the EPA when they sets the MRLs for glyphosate, for instance, it's not the same for apples versus pears. You can have more glyphosate in this and less glyphosate in this, and what it comes down to is sort of usage. Is the companies will go to the EPA and say, this is how much we expect to be sprayed on this crop, and we've done the research, and these are the residue levels that we're seeing left in the food. So we need our MRL to be here. And then the EPA will look at that and decide if that violates safety measures and research that shows exposure, getting in toxicology. They look at animal studies and they look at impacts. And they will say yes or no on the MRL. The EPA has very rarely said no to Monsanto, and they do it for, all the chemical companies go, but the MRLs, it's interesting, they change, right? So what used to be considered the safe level, now it's up here. You can just go more and more and more and more higher. And Europe's levels are down here. We allow so much more in terms of pesticide residues in our foods than most other countries around the world. Don't know if I answered you. I probably didn't.
I understand. Thank you.
So times have changed a lot since Rachel Carson wrote, and now we've seen that money can influence public opinion very effectively
Right.
and change elections. So how can you talk about how your efforts are being countered, and how you think that we can better reach people and modify public opinion?
Yeah. So, in terms of my efforts being countered, I mean, the Monsanto and different chemical industry groups, come after me, like, a lot. And they did when I was at Reuters, and they tried to push me out of Reuters, and they've used Academics Review to write articles about what a terrible journalist I am. And they, that sort of thing. And when people try to invite me to speak or something, they will usually get criticized. There was a webinar I was in a couple of weeks ago with the Center for Security and Sustainability that wanted to look at these issues, and and so members of the chemical industry wrote letters to all the people in the steering committee for the Security and Sustainability Forum demanding that they close down the webinar. So I mean, it's that kind of thing. They don't want to engage in debate or discussion. Monsanto's chairman was supposed to be opposite me at a hearing in front of the European Parliament in Brussels to talk about these matters, and they declined to show up, which really made the Parliament angry. So, you know, that kind of thing. In terms of what do we do? I mean, what do we do, right? I mean, money and power in Washington is so embedded. So, I mean, I think we have to get the money out of politics, but, you know, it's like, I don't know that that's doable. So the thing that I see going on around the country and around the world is more citizen driven. It's more grassroots. As people become aware and they become engaged and they become concerned, maybe they make small changes. Maybe they buy from a farmer they know, or they buy local, or they grow their own, or they decide they want to buy organic, or they or maybe they get a bunch of people together and go to their school district and say, we don't want this on our kids' playgrounds, or their city council. Or they, you know, or a lot of people I know think it's great to go to Washington, D.C. and tromp around on Capitol Hill, and, you know, but it's whatever your comfort level and your engagement level is, but it's real. It's a real concern. It's affecting our health. It's affecting the future for our children. So it's up to you how much, you know, you care about that, but we have to try to hold our leadership accountable, I think.
As I understand it, one of the arguments that the industry has been using to cite the quote-unquote safety of glyphosate is that after it's used in the field, it breaks down into its component elements, and therefore its safety. I take it you believe that's either not true or irrelevant. How do you address that?
Well, I mean, scientists who have been studying this find that it persists in the soil, and that it affects the microbial community, the health of the microbial community in the soil, and you know that affects future plantings and the health, and it necessitates the need of more different fungicides because weeds are more susceptible to disease. You know, we know that it maintains and is found in waterways, and that it doesn't go away and break down and go away. We know it's found in U.S. Geological Survey has found it, you know, prominently in rivers and streams and surface waters. It's found in water supply sheds for numerous cities and towns across the country. So breakdown is sort of a relative term, I guess, to me. We know it's in our bodies. So is that broken down or is that not broken down? I don't know. Yeah.
One word you haven't mentioned tonight, ironically, is the word Iowa.
Iowa.
And of course, a lot of what you're talking about, it goes on here, obviously with the planting of crops and with the use of herbicides. But a question about, and maybe this seems partisan, but a question about a certain university in another city named Ames. And I haven't heard you mention anything about that, but what role, they were alleged to have a major role in big ag,
Right.
in the state of Iowa. Can you specify the role they've had with regard to pesticides, herbicides, and other things you've been talking about?
Big bad Iowa State. We just beat them, Kansas Jayhawks, on Tuesday. I was so glad to see that. You know what, I have to say, so in all the documents that we've gotten that show collusion or collaboration and that sort of thing, dozens and dozens of land-grant state universities around the country. Haven't seen a ton with Iowa State. Now, I don't know what that means or doesn't mean. University of Nebraska, University of Illinois, University of Florida, you know, Cornell, like lots of universities haven't seen that quite as much through Iowa State, but of course Iowa State's hugely important, and you know, you've got DuPont, Pioneer, you know, here in Johnston, and certainly they've carried a lot of sway in, you know, federal politics in terms of, you know, USDA and ag leadership and that sort of thing. So, but I haven't seen specific evidence of what I would call, you know, collusion and wrongdoing. But if you know of any, you could share that with me.
Hi.
Hello.
Well, thank you for writing the book. It's hard to figure out what piece to mention. I'm reminded of the last conversation I had with Norman Borlaug.
Oh,
Which
you
was
had a
specific-
conversation with Norman Borlaug?
Yeah, I'm either that old or it wasn't that long ago. He only passed away a few years ago. Because I really wanted to challenge him, but in a very respectful way.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of the work that, because he, with Ruan and the World Food Prize, which I don't know the percentages, but Monsanto has underwritten and supported an awful lot of that. And
Right.
a really dear friend of mine from Canada, who was part of, well, I don't want to go down that track too much, because I have something else I want to talk about.
Okay.
But the point is, he really passed away feeling 100% that, his stake was still in the ground, that all of that work that he did needed to be, we needed those chemicals in order to be able to increase yields. And obviously, he won the Nobel Prize in '70, specifically around having engineered the wheat to be shorter to increase the yields. But there's an awful lot of information that's coming out now, particularly in the research institute where it was both in India and in Mexico, of all kinds of negative things that have happened since then. In 1993, I don't know if you remember Congresswoman Bella Abzug, but yeah, you really are young. But anyway, but some of us in this room remember her. She had me start the Women, Cancer, and the Environment program out of WEDO, the Women's Environment and Development Organization, and it was specifically in terms of tracking. And I just want to bring up 3 things that happened. You didn't happen to mention them, but 3 things that happened since '92. But the reason the U.S. didn't sign the Biodiversity Treaty in '92 had nothing to do with biodiversity. It had everything to do with GMOs and pesticide use.
Mhm.
And you have to get to the 3rd section of the treaty text before you realize that. And Democrats and Republicans,
Wow.
in the Senate in particular, all fell right in line around that. But one of the things we found was that you found women it's going to be about women. Women as pathologists began to say something is really, really wrong. The histologies of the tumors, particularly the tracking of cancers that happened at points of critical hormonal change.
Mm.
So gestation,
Mhm.
menses, pregnancy, menopause. And that was how, everybody knows Aaron Brockovich and the family with the 5 girls.
Right.
And PG&E said, but not all 5 of your daughters got cancer, therefore it couldn't have been, what we did in Hinckley. But the ones that did, all were at critical points
Yeah.
of hormonal change. And so the increasing, and I want you to think about that, the increasing number of women as pathologists, particularly around the bioaccumulative cancers, the work around IPEN and POPs and the persistent organic pesticides. And I don't want to take too long, but this one last piece, because it was what told me what I had to do for the rest of my life. PAN, the Pesticide Action Network out of Malaysia, worked with a lot of women's groups. Rice and many of the other food crops in Asia are particularly human labor intensive.
Sure.
So women do a lot of that work. But by and large, a lot of women who are not very literate, and the people who manage the workers aren't particularly literate. So we found that there were women who were working in the fields. Their children were being brought to them. Their infants were being brought to them to nurse. No protective equipment, no gloves, nada. And because the guys, and they were guys, who were doing the mixing weren't particularly well versed. It's like if it says 1 to 2, maybe I ought to put 2 times or 3 times as much. And so when we did the testing or worked with the groups that had done the testing, the concentrations were at least 3 times as much as they should have been on the recommended levels.
Yeah.
And you're finding if those levels are used, that's already problematic. And to me, I thought it was interesting to have 365, which is Whole Foods house brand, primarily organic foods, was on your list of the ones that had residues.
Yeah.
I have a question in there.
I want your
But I
card. I'm going to call you a lot. Will you give it to me? Okay.
Well, hi, I came from Argentina. I would like to add just 3 or 4 points. First of all, we have the same kind of problems, the same kind of discussions. Actually, I suffered it personally too. My fiance's mother was an extremely healthy person who lived in a farm, and she died last year of a very aggressive indole cancer that had no other explanation than the glyphosate that they were using on the farm without knowing the consequences and how to manage all that. And for what I know, in Argentina we use even more glyphosate per acre than that you do here. So the problem in some point is even worse. The second point is that Monsanto seems to have the same strategies in a global level with very mafious methods, where some honest scientists that say the truth are fired from their positions in universities or wherever the job is.
Right.
One day they arrive to their office and they found it closed, and they find they are fired. So this is a very violent method, not only the ghostwriting, but even when someone writes his or her voice about this, he may suffer consequences. So this is it seems to be a global strategy. And the third point about what to do, also this problem, I think it's worse in our country. There is an important grassroots movement that has achieved a lot of its goals. Basically, in a local level, we managed we achieve new legislation for which farmers cannot use Monsanto around certain distance of rural communities and schools and so on. There's a particular situation. There's a net of what we call fumigated towns. Is it right?
Yeah.
You understand me?
It's in the
There's
book.
a net of physicians that is coordinated this kind of struggles in different towns to stop the fumigation, at least around the towns, and that is making that farmers that used to grow their certain kind of product, basically soybeans, they are obligated to do another kind of production with other methods. And that's very interesting because they are going through agroecology's experiences, organic experiences, and so on because of these grassroots movements. But there is a complex situation in which that movements are of the people who live in the communities, but not of farmers. So there are rural communities against farmers who think that everything is okay. So that's a very complex situation, and a very that maybe makes 5 different sectors of the people. So they are trying to solve that, but maybe sometimes they do not understand that. But it's important for me, the local level, the state measures to take measures that it's over what one farmer, a particular farmer, can understand or not. This is bad for our health, and it doesn't matter at all if he understands that. It's a public health matter, not just a private matter of what he does on his farm. It's something that has to do with everyone who lives there. So that was beside the national level and so on, macro public opinion things that we can do. There are interesting experiences at the local level that may help to change the situation.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, Argentina is a sad story. I mean, so many people impacted, and like you've talked about, and I've written about that in the book. There's chapters devoted to that. But yeah, it gets back to sort of the protective measures. They push back against even things that buffer zones and reducing times that you can spray and reducing aerial spraying that could drift over and affect neighboring schools or populations. They're doing the same thing in Hawaii. where children are being sickened and birth defects are rising and that sort of thing. So they just really want to push back on, well, you're seeing it with dicamba right now, right? And all of those issues with the farmers and millions of acres of crops that have been affected by dicamba, and Arkansas is trying to put in place measures to be more protective, and Monsanto's suing them, saying, how dare you try to regulate the use of dicamba, for crying out loud. Yeah, sorry.
I wonder if you have any insight how USGS gets away with it. They publish all this information when these other federal agencies don't, in following the literature.
Yeah, right? I don't know. One thing I found, maybe somebody out here has found it, this is sort of an aside, EPA, was it EPA, every year published like volumes of pesticide use in the United States for a number of years. Like USGS would do it, and EPA, and they would track, volumes of glyphosate and volumes of this and volumes of that. And then around 2009, it sort of trailed off. And you can't get good data about specific other than from USGS. And they're very, when you talk to them, though they're very circumspect about, is it bad, is it good, what does it mean? I mean, it's hard to get them, I think, to
But at least they have numbers.
But at least they have some numbers, you're right, yeah.
Okay, we have time for one last question here.
Thank you. And it's a really important story that you're telling, and I really appreciate that you're approaching it as a journalist and sort of helping us sift through. My question has to do with public science and sort of science literacy, and whether you see, I guess, if you have anything to say about that as a journalist, but also whether you see Monsanto and kind of the money in chemical agriculture attempting to influence the way science is taught, because as a lay person, I think it's very easy to go kind of all the way to all the extremes, like, oh well, we should never use any pesticides, right, then they're all bad, to this kind of overreach.
Right.
And when you look at those USGS maps, they're incredible. You should go to the website. It's our science. It's public science, and I mean, you can see that there's overuse of things happening, a whole hell of a lot of it right here, that is making it very hard to sift through and figure out, is there a reasonable way to use some of these things, or how do we interpret? Right. Anyway, the question really had to do with whether you see the big money in chemical agriculture trying to influence even the way people understand science.
Yes. Well, definitely. I mean, yeah, in so many different ways. So not only those, what I call front groups, but because they are promoting science, and they hold boot camps for journalists to understand, to train the journalists how to understand the science. And there are things called, there's a science media center for journalists to come to, and they will tell you how to interpret the science, and they will provide you with experts that you can quote. And they never tell you that they're getting financing from the chemical industry. The chemical industry is funding curriculum now for elementary, middle, and high school students that doesn't say that it's funded by the chemical industry, but will tell you my 10-year-old brought a packet home, not too long ago, and you'll see it in schools all around. It talks about GMO corn and how great it is, and it talks about glyphosate and how great glyphosate is, and this is little kids in middle school, and it's to indoctrinate this idea of this, pesticide dependent, pesticides are great kind of thing. And we have universities, as we've talked about, professors that are getting research dollars and getting unrestricted grants that are being sent to them, and then Monsanto will encourage them and collaborate with them. And I've talked to a lot of those professors, and if they're trying to do research or put out papers that talk about balance, or talk about, what can we do to be more sustainable and to reduce our pesticide use, they get pushed back on. And a lot of them, there's a professor at the University of Missouri that was writing about soil health and glyphosate impacts. He'd studied it ever since glyphosate was introduced, pretty much, 30 years of data. And he worked for USDA, but he was housed at University of Missouri. And he got pushback. USDA didn't want him to publish his data. And there's a Monsanto auditorium at University of Missouri. Like, I mean, there's, you know,
Headquartered in St. Louis. Not
right.
totally surprised.
But there's money and there's
Oh, no, I'm not
influence
justifying
and
it at all.
it's throughout, and it's everywhere. We have critical reviews in toxicology, a science journal. The editor there, Wallace Hayes, we have documents showing he was getting $400 an hour as a consultant to Monsanto. At the same time, the critical reviews in toxicology is supposed to be looking at science, and they had an editor there who was getting money from Monsanto and Dow and DuPont and Syngenta, Goodman, who was an editor there, and you can see in the memos he gets a new paper, I think it was from Sri Lanka, looking at glyphosate impacts, and it found harmful impacts, and he emails Monsanto and says, hey, I just got this paper here at Critical Reviews in Toxicology, what should I say about it? Can you tell me what I should say about it? So.
This has been a really great discussion. Thank you all for supporting this event. Carey Gillam is happy to talk with you and sign copies of the book for you, which we have for sale. Thank you all so much for your support
Thank you.
of this event.
Thank you.